So in this video, I want to show you how to create a grid of images. When you finish, we're going to end up with something that looks like this. When you roll over these, you'll notice that the opacity changes a little bit, and we get a little bit of a border come in. We want this to be centered in the middle of the page like this. So we're going to write the CSS for that. I'm going to start off by just deleting what I have right now and showing you the HTML. So let's save that and come over here. You can see that my HTML is pretty easy, just a basic HTML page. And then I have a div with an ID of image list. And in there I have a series of images with an anchor tag wrapped around them. The anchor tags have a link or a clickable to the larger version of the photos. There's an images folder right here. And in that images folder, I have a thumbnail version of the image, which is a 75 by 75 pixel image. Then I have some larger versions. So if I go through these, you can see the small ones and the large ones. So if we look at the HTML, the images are essentially an anchor tag that have an image tag inside. It looks something like this. So in the href, I place a link to the high resolution version, right? High res. And then on the image, then I just link to the low resolution version. And I definitely have to have an alt tag, so I'll have an alt tag in there. But pretty simple HTML, just repeat it a few times for each one of the images. So let's go ahead and dig into our CSS file. I'll start off with the body tag. And in the body tag, I'll first start by setting up the background image. And we'll do that by just linking to the image in the images folder. And it's called wooden.jpg. And that file is right here. It's called just a wood background. It repeats. So we want to make sure we take off all this other junk. So when you finish with it, it should look like this. Notice that there's a little bit of spacing to the left and the top of the image grid. That's because the body of a regular page always has a little bit of a margin and a padding attached to it. We'll clear those out, so we'll set the margin and padding to 0. I'm going to target my image list, and I'm going to show you how to get rid of that little space. It's kind of a trick. We can set the font size to 0. That gets rid of that spacing in between. If I wanted to center 3 of those images in the middle of the page, then I know that each of these images is 75 pixels. So 75 times 3 is 225. So I can set the width of this thing right here to 225 pixels. That gives me a 3-image grid. And to center it, I need to set the margin to 0 and auto. Margin 0 here means at the top and bottom, I want no margin. And on the left and right, I want the browser to calculate the width of the margin automatically. What that does is center this grid of images within the browser width. Let's target the image list anchor tag. And what I'm going to do there is add a margin of 2 pixels. That gives me a little bit more breathing room in between the images. But now it's kind of breaking up our width over here. That's, again, because we're setting it to 225. And 225 is the width of 3 without any sort of margin. So we have to add our margin in. Let's go ahead and pull up my calculator. And 75 pixels plus 4, because it's 2 on each side, equals 79 times 3 is going to be 237. So if I do 237 here, it'll now work. 237. And now we've got the 3 images side by side. So whenever you calculate width, you got to add up not just the width of the image, but the width of the image plus the margin. So let's go ahead and add a border, see what happens. So border, 4 pixels, solid, and then we'll just give it a color. So a couple of weird things are happening. Notice that there is nothing, no text in here, so it's collapsing the border. And it's also screwing up our width once again. So we're going to have to recalculate the width with this additional border. Let's go ahead and do that first since we just did this. So let's clear this out. 75 pixels plus 4 for the margins plus 8 is 87 times 3 for 3 images is 261. Let's modify this to 261. But we still have that other weird little problem with the anchor text. Now, it doesn't actually matter. These things are still clickable. It's just that the borders are collapsing to the height of the text, which there is no text in there. So I need to change the display of these things to inline block. That'll fix the other problem. See, now everything looks pretty nice. And next, I want to go ahead and make the border, this border right here, I want to change it whenever somebody hovers over the image. So I'll do image list anchor and then hover. So when somebody rolls over one of those images, I want to change the border color to white. And that will do a nice kind of rollover effect. But now I don't really want to see this border whenever the image is not being hovered over. So I could just sort of get rid of this border here, but something weird will happen. So you can see this actually became smaller, and that's really not what we want. We don't want the spacing to go away. So I'll just set this color to transparent, and that's actually a color in CSS, and that leaves the space for the rollover, and the rollover changes the color to white. Let's work on our image borders. I want my image borders to be rounded. So to do that, I'll have to use border radius, and I can do 10 pixels, and that makes the edges round. Now, look what happens now when I roll over. The edges of my borders are still square. So that looks a little bit funky. So we need to go ahead and add this border radius onto our anchor tags. Right, so let's do that. And that looks better, but there's sometimes like a little bit of a hole here. So what I'm going to do is just make this one have less of a border radius. So we'll do 6 pixels there, and now it looks pretty good, I think. Whenever you use some of these CSS3 attributes like border radius, you have to make sure you try to be as compatible with older browsers as possible. So to do that, we actually have to have some prefixes. If you go to this website, you could see it gives you all the different prefixes for the different rules. So border radiuses are not as bad. We just have to include WebKit border radius. But on some things like transitions or transforms, you have to add prefixes for WebKit, which is Safari and Chrome, MOS, which is Firefox, MS, which is Microsoft or Internet Explorer, and O, which is Opera. So, and then the regular version of the CSS. So to do this properly, we would have to make sure we add WebKit border radius, and then we add the same rule, and we'll do the same thing down here. So let's work on the opacity of these images here. What I'm going to do is on my anchor tag, I'm going to set the opacity right here to be, I'll make it 0.5, so that makes it not be as opaque, and I can modify that on hover, of course. I'll make the opacity 1, so that's a number from 0 to 1, and now when you roll over them, they become very visible. It would be actually cooler if we animated that transition. So to do that, you would use the transition attribute. And again, this is a CSS3 rule. So we can say this means change everything, and then you give it a timing attribute here. So 3.3 seconds, and then an animation attribute here. So we could say ease in, ease out, or ease in and out. Whenever I think of ease in and out, I think of the word ease as the word slow, and the word in as the word beginning, and out would be end. So I always think of this as slow at the beginning, faster at the end. Now, this is not going to work because this browser requires you to have the WebKit prefix. So again, we have to use WebKit transition, right? And now you'll see the transition happening. It's kind of a slower version of it. We have to add the prefixes for all other browsers. So remember to go to this website, and remember you have to add WebKit, MOS, MS, and O. So we'll do that here. That's how you do a centered grid of images of a certain width with transitions and opacity settings on hover.